There are moments in war when words become weapons more dangerous than artillery. When a single sentence transforms into a death warrant signed by the speaker himself. Eastern France, autumn of 1944, witnessed such a moment. The air hung thick with the smell of cordite and wet stone as American forces tightened their grip around an ancient fortress that sat like a defiant fist on the landscape. Inside those medieval walls, 1,500 German soldiers waited under the command of a major who believed that honor was measured in blood, that surrender was a stain worse than death, and that his oath to the Third Reich meant more than the lives of the men under his command. The fortress itself seemed to mock the American advance, its thick stone walls and elevated position speaking of centuries when such places were unconquerable. But this was 1944. And the rules had changed in ways the German major either didn't understand or refused to acknowledge. The American commander facing this obstacle was George Patton, a man whose reputation preceded him like thunder before lightning. Patton understood something fundamental about warfare that separated him from both idealistic and unnecessarily brutal commanders. He knew that every hour spent fighting was an hour not spent advancing. Every casualty taken assaulting a position was one less soldier for future battles. Every resource expended on a siege was a resource unavailable elsewhere. This wasn't mercy in any traditional sense. It was the cold mathematics of efficient warfare. So Patton did what he almost always did when facing a fortified position. He sent a messenger forward under the white flag of parley, carrying terms that were straightforward and non-negotiable. Surrender immediately. Your men will be treated according to Geneva Convention standards. They'll be fed, given medical care, housed in prisoner of war camps where they'll survive the war and eventually return to their families. Your alternative is a battle you cannot win that will cost lives on both sides and accomplish nothing except adding bodies to the count. The German major's response wasn't just a refusal. It was theater. It was a challenge wrapped in bravado and delivered with the kind of dramatic conviction that might sound heroic in the retelling around a fire decades later. He sent back a message designed to inspire his troops and intimidate his enemies, crafted to show that German officers still had steel in their spines even as their nation crumbled. Tell General Patton that if he wants this fortress, if he wants these walls and this ground, he'll have to kill me to take it. I will never surrender to Americans. My oath forbids it. My honor demands resistance. Come and do your worst, and you'll find German soldiers who know how to die for something greater than themselves. It was meant to sound unbreakable. The kind of statement that rallies wavering troops and makes attackers reconsider the cost of assault. The kind of dramatic declaration that becomes legend regardless of outcome. Patton's staff officers expected anger when the messenger returned with this defiant challenge. They anticipated frustration, perhaps strategic discussions about whether to bypass the fortress entirely and leave it as an isolated garrison cut off from supply and support. Some thought Patton might increase his surrender terms, offering better conditions to persuade the major that discretion was the better part of valor. Instead, Patton's response was 4 words that would echo through the remainder of the European campaign and become a cautionary tale whispered among German commanders. I can arrange that. No anger, no frustration, no attempt to negotiate or persuade. Just a simple acknowledgement that the major had stated his terms clearly, and Patton was prepared to honor them exactly as requested. If the major wanted to die defending his fortress, Patton would facilitate that outcome with maximum efficiency and minimum delay. What the German major failed to understand was that he'd just given Patton explicit permission to do exactly what military efficiency already suggested. The major thought he was issuing a challenge. What he'd actually done was remove any political or moral restraint that might have encouraged a more cautious approach. He'd transformed a military obstacle that might require careful handling into a target that could be engaged with total commitment. Patton immediately began issuing orders with the precision of a man arranging a complex machinery of destruction. First came complete encirclement, not merely blocking roads but establishing a total seal around the fortress perimeter. No supplies in, no reinforcements in, no messengers in or out. Cut the water lines if accessible. Make it clear to everyone inside that they were now in a prison with stone walls and no hope of relief. The fortress might be strong, but the men inside still needed water, food, ammunition, and the psychological comfort of knowing they weren't abandoned. They would have none of these things. Second, Patton ordered every heavy artillery piece within range to register precise targeting coordinates on the fortress. This wasn't going to be random harassment fire meant to keep defenders' heads down. This was going to be systematic demolition. Stone walls from the 15th century might stop musket balls and even resist field guns from earlier wars, but they weren't designed to withstand modern high-explosive shells fired by guns that could drop rounds onto specific buildings from miles away. The underground chambers and bunkers that made the fortress defensible would become death traps when their roofs collapsed under sustained bombardment. Third came air support, but not the area bombing that had flattened so many cities. Patton wanted precision. He wanted fighter bombers with specific targets, ammunition depots and artillery positions and command bunkers identified through reconnaissance and marked for destruction. The goal wasn't to level everything inside the walls. The goal was to surgically remove the fortress's ability to function as a military position while simultaneously demonstrating to everyone inside that there was nowhere safe, nowhere to hide, nowhere that American firepower couldn't reach. Then came the psychological component, and this revealed Patton's understanding of how fear works on the human mind. He ordered loudspeakers brought forward to positions surrounding the fortress. These weren't going to broadcast random propaganda or appeals to surrender, at least not initially. They were going to announce a schedule. A timetable of destruction delivered in German by native speakers who explained with bureaucratic precision exactly what would happen and when. At dawn, artillery bombardment of the eastern walls. At mid-morning, air strikes on the command bunker and ammunition storage. At noon, assault through breached walls. This served multiple purposes. It gave the defenders time to think, time to imagine what was coming, time to question whether their major's dramatic oath was worth dying for. It also established that American forces were so confident, so thoroughly in control, that they could announce their plans in advance, without fear that the Germans could do anything to counter them. Patton also made clear to his subordinate commanders that this operation would not follow the careful, casualty-averse doctrine that characterized some American assaults. The Germans inside had been offered generous terms. They'd refused through their commander's theatrical challenge. What happened next was the consequence of that choice. The assault would be overwhelming, coordinated, and swift. Get it done in hours, not days. Use every resource available. The major wanted his Götterdämmerung, his heroic last stand. Give him one so intense and so devastating that it becomes a lesson for every other German garrison considering similar dramatics. Make it clear through action that challenging Patton to do what military logic already suggested was not deterrence but invitation. The night before the assault was its own form of warfare. The German soldiers inside the fortress knew what was coming. The loudspeakers had told them. They had hours of darkness to contemplate dawn, hours to listen to American tanks moving into position, hours to hear the rumble of heavy guns being sighted and registered, hours for doubt to spread among men who'd been conscripted into someone else's war and were now trapped in a fortress by a commander's oath that meant nothing to them personally. The major tried to maintain order and discipline. He gave speeches about duty and honor. He threatened anyone who spoke of surrender with summary execution. He tried to channel the fear into defiance. But fear is a liquid that flows around obstacles, and the major's speeches couldn't stop his men from understanding basic mathematics. They were 1,500 troops with limited ammunition, no hope of reinforcement, facing an enemy with unlimited supplies and total air superiority. Honor wouldn't stop artillery shells. Oaths wouldn't deflect bombs. When dawn broke, the artillery commenced exactly on schedule, just as the loudspeakers had promised. The German defenders might have hoped the announced timetable was psychological warfare, an exaggeration meant to encourage surrender. The first salvo destroyed that hope along with 30 feet of medieval stone wall. This wasn't harassing fire. This was concentrated, precise, devastating bombardment from multiple batteries firing in coordinated patterns. The same sections of war were hit repeatedly, not randomly, but according to a plan designed by engineers who understood exactly how stone fortifications fail under sustained impact. Each shell weakened the structure. Each impact spread cracks. Each explosion sent shockwaves through the foundation. German artillery crews inside the fortress tried to respond, tried to suppress the American guns, but counter-battery fire was immediate and brutally effective. The Americans had radar that could track shell trajectories back to their origin. German guns would fire once, maybe twice, and then American responses would obliterate their position. The lesson was clear and quickly learned. Shooting back meant death. After 2 hours of this systematic destruction, the airstrikes began. P-47 Thunderbolts came in low, carrying not the incendiary bombs used against cities, but precision munitions designed for point targets. The Major's command post, identified through reconnaissance, took multiple direct hits. The ammunition storage, located in what the Germans thought was a protected bunker, was struck by bombs that penetrated before detonating, causing secondary explosions that sent flames hundreds of feet into the air and cooked off stored artillery shells in a chain reaction that lasted 20 minutes. The main gate, the fortress's primary defensive choke point, was blown off its hinges by bombs that left a crater where there had once been a controlled entrance. Through all of this, the loudspeakers continued broadcasting, describing what was happening, announcing what would come next, offering a final opportunity to surrender before infantry assault, making clear that anyone walking out with hands raised would be treated well, would be given water and food and medical care, would survive. This was perhaps the cruelest aspect of Patton's approach. Cruel in the sense of being brutally effective rather than unnecessarily violent. The Germans inside weren't being given one terrible choice. They were being given an easy alternative continuously throughout their nightmare. At any moment, any soldier could choose to stop the horror simply by walking toward American lines with empty hands. This wasn't theoretical. Small groups began doing exactly that. First, a few soldiers who'd had enough. Then larger groups. Then entire squads who'd collectively decided their major's oath didn't bind them to suicide. They'd slip through damaged sections of wall, hands high, moving toward American positions where they'd be directed to collection points, given water, checked for wounds, and processed as prisoners. Each group that surrendered served as advertisement to those remaining. See, the Americans are keeping their word. Surrender means survival. The major tried desperately to maintain control as his garrison dissolved around him. He positioned loyal troops at breach points with orders to shoot anyone attempting to desert. Several soldiers were executed this way, shot by their own countrymen for the crime of choosing life. But this draconian approach backfired catastrophically. Troops realized they were trapped between American firepower from outside and German bullets from within. The major's attempts to enforce discipline through terror only accelerated the psychological collapse. Soldiers started questioning not just the wisdom of continued resistance, but the sanity of their commander. Why were they dying for a position that meant nothing? Why was their major's personal honor more important than their lives? Why had reasonable surrender terms been refused? These questions spread through the defenders faster than any American propaganda could have achieved. By midday, the fortress was no longer a military position. It was a ruin. Walls breached in multiple locations, artillery positions silent and smoking, the command structure decapitated by the precision strikes. German defenders scattered in small pockets, some still willing to fight, many more simply trying to survive until they could figure out how to surrender without being shot by their own officers. Then, American infantry attacked, not from a single direction which could be defended, but from every breach simultaneously. Sherman tanks rolled to point-blank range and fired directly through openings in walls, using high-explosive shells to clear rooms and collapse structures. Flamethrowers cleared bunkers that had survived the bombardment. Engineers used satchel charges to collapse remaining strong points. But the remarkable thing, the detail that would be noted in after-action reports, was how little actual combat occurred. The preparation had been so thorough, the preliminary bombardment so devastating that there wasn't much left to fight. German resistance was sporadic and disorganized. Small groups would engage briefly, realize they were surrounded and outgunned, and surrender. The Major's threats about shooting deserters had lost all force. There was no coherent command structure left to enforce them. American forces moved through the fortress methodically, section by section, with loudspeakers following them broadcasting continuous surrender appeals in flawless German. "Lay down your weapons. Walk toward our troops with hands visible. You will not be harmed. You will be given water, food, medical care. The war is over for you, but your life continues." Many Germans took this offer gratefully, relieved to have survived, relieved to have the decision taken out of their hands. The Major himself was found in what remained of his command bunker, a reinforced position that had partially collapsed under bombardment but still provided shelter. He'd barricaded himself inside with a handful of officers who'd remained loyal either out of conviction or fear. When American combat engineers blasted through the barricade, the Major reportedly raised his pistol. An American sergeant, whose name wasn't recorded in official reports but who was simply doing his job, shot the Major twice in the chest. There was no dramatic dialogue. No final speech. No moment where the Major recognized the futility of his stance. Just professional violence ending a threat. The Major had said Patton would have to kill him. That's exactly what happened. Executed by a sergeant who had probably never heard the original challenge, but who responded appropriately to an enemy officer pointing a weapon. The handful of German officers with the Major immediately surrendered once he fell. They'd followed his orders to the very end, but with their commander dead, they had no interest in dying for a lost cause. The entire operation, from the commencement of artillery bombardment to the final German surrender, took less than 12 hours. American casualties were remarkably light. A handful of wounded from sporadic German fire, none killed. The systematic preparation had made the actual combat almost anticlimactic. German casualties told a different story. The Major was dead, his challenge answered literally. Approximately 200 other German soldiers were killed, most during the bombardment or airstrikes rather than in close combat. Another 300 were wounded with injuries ranging from minor shrapnel wounds to catastrophic trauma from collapsed structures. The remaining 1,000, nearly 2/3 of the original garrison, surrendered and were processed as prisoners of war. They'd survived the remainder of the conflict in camps and eventually returned to a Germany very different from the one they'd left. American intelligence officers who examined the fortress in the aftermath found evidence of how close the position had been to internal collapse even before the assault began. They discovered notes from junior German officers questioning the Major's decision, suggesting that surrender would be more honorable than pointless death. They found records of soldiers executed for attempting to desert, shot by their own commanders to enforce discipline. They found signs that morale had been fracturing for days before the actual battle, that the Major's dramatic defiance had trapped his men in an impossible situation with a commander who valued his personal conception of honor more than their survival. The Major had believed his theatrical challenge would inspire his troops to heroic resistance. Instead, it had imprisoned them with a fanatic who'd rather see them die than admit defeat. Patton toured the captured fortress the following day, walking through rubble that had been defensive positions, past bodies that had been soldiers, through what remained of the Major's command post. Officers accompanying him reported that he showed no satisfaction, no gloating, no sense of triumph. His demeanor was matter-of-fact, almost bureaucratic. The major said we'd have to kill him. We did. That's the natural consequence of stating your terms clearly to someone who'll take you at your word. But Patton also made a point during that inspection tour that revealed the other side of his philosophy. He visited the aid stations where wounded German prisoners were being treated. He personally ensured they were receiving the same level of medical care as American wounded. He had American medics treating German soldiers side by side with their own casualties, making no distinction in the quality of care based on uniform. He wanted his troops to understand the complete picture, be utterly ruthless in combat against enemies who choose to fight, be utterly professional and humane with enemies who surrender or are wounded. Never blur that line. Never let combat brutality bleed into treatment of prisoners. The moment someone stops fighting, they stop being a target and become a responsibility. Word of what happened at the fortress spread through both armies with the speed of wildfire through dry grass. For American troops, it reinforced their understanding of Patton's command philosophy. He would use overwhelming force when necessary, but he always offered alternatives first. The German major had been given multiple opportunities to surrender on generous terms. His death wasn't the result of American brutality or bloodlust. It was the direct consequence of his own choice, his own theatrical challenge taken at face value. This distinction mattered to American soldiers who wanted to see themselves as liberators rather than butchers. They could apply maximum violence with clear consciences because they'd offered the alternative first. For German forces, the story carried a different and more chilling message. The issue wasn't that the fortress fell. Fortresses fell throughout the war. The issue was how completely it fell, how systematically it was reduced, how the major's dramatic defiance accomplished nothing except getting hundreds of his men killed or wounded for a position that held less than a day. German commanders began circulating the story not as propaganda, but as practical advice. When American forces offer surrender, particularly if they're part of Patton's Third Army, take the offer seriously. Don't make dramatic challenges. Don't dare them to do what military logic already suggests, because they'll accept the dare and fulfill it with efficiency that makes resistance seem pointless in retrospect. Some German officers later stated in post-war interrogations that they'd surrendered their positions specifically because they'd heard about the fortress. They'd learned that Patton's threats weren't opening negotiating positions or psychological warfare. They were simple statements of fact delivered with the expectation of being taken literally. This psychological impact might have been the most significant outcome of the 12-hour battle. Every fortress garrison that surrendered without resistance after hearing this story saved lives on both sides and accelerated the Allied advance. Every German commander who decided his personal honor wasn't worth the lives of his men made a rational choice partly because he knew what happened to those who made the opposite choice. The fortress battle became a teaching tool, a cautionary tale that spread through the German army and changed behavior. This wasn't accidental. Patton understood that reputation was a force multiplier. One brutal but justified demonstration could prevent future battles by making resistance seem futile. The major's death purchased surrender elsewhere, a grim arithmetic that nonetheless saved lives overall. Looking back at this incident from the perspective of decades, it raises uncomfortable questions about leadership, responsibility, and the nature of honor in impossible situations. The German major presumably believed he was doing the right thing. He'd taken an oath to defend German territory against invasion. He'd been taught that surrender was disgraceful, that officers should prefer death to capitulation. His dramatic challenge to Patton wasn't cynical theater. He likely meant it sincerely. He genuinely believed his willingness to die would inspire his men and make the Americans reconsider the cost of assault. But sincerity doesn't change outcomes when you're facing overwhelming force and your opponent is willing to take you at your word. The major's honor, his oath, his conception of duty, none of it mattered against artillery and air power and an enemy commander who responded to challenges by accepting them. What did the major's defiance actually accomplish? He wanted to defend German honor, to prove that Wehrmacht officers wouldn't surrender meekly, to make the Americans pay a price for their advance. What he actually achieved was getting 200 of his men killed, 300 wounded, and 1,000 sent to prisoner of war camps for a position that fell in less than 12 hours and delayed Patton's advance by such a minimal amount it barely registered in operational planning. If he'd accepted the initial surrender terms, all 1,500 of his troops would have survived. They'd have spent the remainder of the war in camps. Relatively safe, relatively healthy. Many would have returned to their families when hostilities ended. Instead, hundreds died or were maimed. And for what tangible result? The fortress fell regardless. The road junction was in American hands by nightfall. Patton's advance continued without meaningful delay. The Major's heroic last stand changed nothing except the casualty count. This is the brutal arithmetic that idealistic commanders sometimes forget or refuse to acknowledge. Heroic last stands make compelling stories that get retold for generations. They provide material for movies and novels and stirring speeches about courage in the face of impossible odds. But in practical terms, when you're facing overwhelming force with no hope of reinforcement or relief, heroic last stands don't change strategic outcomes. They just increase the number of bodies. The Major thought his willingness to die would matter, that it would inspire his troops and perhaps make the Americans hesitate or offer better terms or conduct a more cautious operation that would at least make his sacrifice meaningful. But Patton didn't hesitate, didn't offer better terms, didn't conduct a cautious operation. He simply applied more force more efficiently. The Major learned this lesson too late. His troops learned it at the cost of their lives or freedom. Other German commanders learned it and made different choices that saved their men. There's a leadership lesson here that extends beyond military contexts into business, politics, and personal relationships. When you make dramatic absolute statements, "You'll have to kill me over my dead body. I'll never surrender. I'll die before I compromise," you need to be prepared for some people to take you literally. Because certain personalities, certain leaders, certain opponents will hear that as a statement of preference rather than a negotiating position. Patton was one of those people. He didn't interpret defiant challenges as opening gambits in a negotiation. He interpreted them as explicit statements of what the challenger wanted. You want to fight to the death? Okay, that's your choice. I'll facilitate that outcome as efficiently as possible. The German Major learned this too late. The fortress fell in September 1944. The Major died there exactly as he'd said he would. His name isn't widely remembered outside specialized military history. The exact location of the fortress matters less than what happened there. What endures is the lesson about the consequences of dramatic statements made to people who'll take you at your word. Other commanders might have been insulted by, "You'll have to kill me," and tried to prove they weren't monsters by offering even better terms or conducting an excessively careful operation to minimize casualties. Patton simply took it as the Major stating his preference and acted accordingly. There's something almost coldly logical about this approach that makes it impossible to argue Patton acted improperly. The Major stated his terms. Only death would make him surrender. Patton provided those exact terms efficiently and professionally. The Major received exactly what he'd requested. For modern audiences examining this story, it raises questions about where responsibility lies. Should Patton have tried harder to persuade the Major? Should he have been more reluctant to kill someone who was essentially committing suicide by soldier, using American troops as his instrument of self-destruction? Or was Patton correct to take people at their word and not waste time on those who'd made their choice clear? Is there something almost respectful about granting someone their explicitly stated wish even when that wish is death? The answer likely depends on your philosophy of leadership and personal responsibility. What's undeniable is the practical outcome. The Major said Patton would have to kill him. Patton did exactly that, efficiently and without hesitation. Every other German commander who heard the story learned to be very careful about what they said to American negotiators. Because with Patton, dramatic challenges weren't deterrents, they weren't theater. They were permissions, they were invitations, they were explicit requests that would be honored literally. The fortress stands today, partially restored, a tourist attraction in eastern France where visitors can walk the same walls that German defenders manned in those final hours. There's a plaque that mentions the battle, though it focuses on the broader context of liberation rather than the specific circumstances. The fortress has seen many sieges across centuries, has changed hands dozens of times, has witnessed the evolution of warfare from crossbows to cruise missiles. But September 1944 might have been its most instructive siege, not because of the tactics employed or the strategic importance of the position, but because of what it revealed about leadership, choice, and consequence. A German major made a dramatic statement he thought sounded heroic. An American general took that statement literally and responded with overwhelming force. 12 hours later, the battle was over, the major was dead, and a lesson was taught that would echo through the remainder of the European campaign. Words have power, but only if the person hearing them respects that power. Challenge someone who'll take you literally, and you might just get exactly what you asked for, delivered with efficiency you never imagined possible. The major wanted Patton to kill him. Patton arranged exactly that. Sometimes the most terrifying response to a dramatic challenge isn't anger or negotiation. Sometimes it's simple agreement followed by methodical action. That's what 1,500 German soldiers learned in September 1944, and what countless others learned from their example.